It's 1983, and if you were a fan of American muscle cars, there wasn't much to get excited about anymore. Just a little more than a decade earlier, the streets had been filled with legendary machines carrying names like Chevelle SS, Camaro Z/28, Pontiac GTO, Plymouth Roadrunner, and Dodge Challenger. Every manufacturer seemed to be chasing more horsepower, bigger engines, and quarter-mile bragging rights. But by the early 1980s, that world had almost disappeared. The oil crisis of the 1970s had forced automakers to rethink everything. Emissions regulations became stricter every year, insurance companies punished buyers who wanted performance cars, and horsepower numbers that once reached well over 350 had fallen dramatically. To many enthusiasts, the muscle car was officially dead. America had traded raw performance for fuel economy, comfort, and practicality. Yet Chevrolet wasn't ready to let that chapter close without one last fight. Instead of trying to recreate the monsters of the late 1960s, the company decided to build something different. Something that respected the new reality while still carrying the spirit of an American performance coupe. That car would become the Chevrolet Monte Carlo SS. And although it would never be the fastest car of its generation, it would quietly become one of the most underrated performance Chevrolets of the 1980s. Personally, I think that's exactly why the Monte Carlo SS deserves more recognition today. It never tried to pretend it was a Corvette, and it never promised impossible levels of performance. Instead, it embraced its own personality. It was stylish, comfortable, unmistakably American, and built for people who still wanted to hear the sound of a V8 every morning before heading to work. To understand why Chevrolet built the Monte Carlo SS, we first have to understand what the Monte Carlo had always been. Introduced for the 1970 model year, the Monte Carlo wasn't originally designed as a pure muscle car. Chevrolet called it a personal luxury coupe, a category that had become incredibly popular across America. Buyers wanted something sportier than a full-size sedan but more comfortable than a traditional pony car. The Monte Carlo offered exactly that. Long hood, short rear deck, elegant styling, rear-wheel drive, and enough V8 power to make highway cruising effortless. Throughout the 1970s, the Monte Carlo became one of Chevrolet's most successful coupes. Even as performance faded across the industry, buyers continued to appreciate its combination of comfort, style, and road presence. But by the time the early 1980s arrived, the automotive world had changed once again. Japanese manufacturers were becoming stronger every year, European brands were attracting buyers with refined handling and advanced engineering, and American companies were struggling to redefine what performance should actually mean. Chevrolet knew it couldn't simply build another big-block muscle car. Those days were over. Instead, engineers focused on creating something that felt exciting within the limitations of the era. The opportunity arrived in 1983 when Chevrolet decided to revive one of its most famous performance badges, Super Sport. The letters SS had once represented some of the most iconic American muscle cars ever built, and bringing them back carried enormous expectations. This wasn't just another trim package. It had to feel special. The Monte Carlo SS immediately stood apart from the ordinary Monte Carlo. The front end featured a redesigned aerodynamic nose that looked noticeably sharper than the standard model. New graphics, unique striping, body-colored mirrors, special wheels, and subtle spoilers gave the coupe a much more purposeful appearance without becoming overly aggressive. Looking at it today, it's easy to see why the design has aged so well. Unlike many cars from the 1980s that relied on excessive plastic cladding and flashy styling, the Monte Carlo SS remained clean, balanced, and instantly recognizable. In my opinion, that's one of the reasons collectors continue to appreciate it. It captures the spirit of the decade without feeling like a caricature of it. Underneath the styling, however, Chevrolet was preparing something even more important. The company selected the high-output version of its 305 cubic inch small-block V8. Now, if you're looking at the specifications today, the numbers might not immediately impress you. Depending on the model year, output ranged from around 175 to 180 horsepower. Compared with the monsters of the late 1960s, that seems almost disappointing. But horsepower alone never tells the whole story. During the early 1980s, those figures were actually respectable for an American V8, especially considering the strict emissions regulations of the time. More importantly, the Monte Carlo SS wasn't about setting quarter-mile records. It was about delivering character. The rumble of a small-block Chevrolet V8, power sent to the rear wheels, comfortable highway manners, and just enough performance to remind drivers that Chevrolet hadn't forgotten its roots. And perhaps the most fascinating part of the story had nothing to do with the engine at all. It had everything to do with racing. Because while the Monte Carlo SS was quietly finding its place on American roads, another version of the car was dominating one of the country's biggest motorsports. NASCAR had become one of America's fastest-growing racing series, and manufacturers understood that success on Sunday could still help sell cars on Monday. Chevrolet invested heavily in competition, and the Monte Carlo quickly became one of the most recognizable silhouettes on the grid. Fans watched it battle Ford, Buick, Pontiac, and Oldsmobile week after week on superspeedways across the country. Even though the race cars shared only a loose connection with their production counterparts, that visual association mattered. Suddenly, the Monte Carlo wasn't just another personal luxury coupe. It became the Chevrolet people saw leading races at Daytona, Talladega, Charlotte, and Atlanta. For many buyers, owning a Monte Carlo SS felt like bringing home a small piece of NASCAR history. That connection gave the car an identity that very few American coupes could match during the 1980s. And while many people today remember the Camaro or Corvette when they think about Chevrolet performance, it's easy to forget that for an entire generation of racing fans, the Monte Carlo was just as important. But despite its growing popularity, the Monte Carlo SS faced fierce competition from every direction, and over the next few years it would have to prove that it deserved the legendary SS badge against some of the most memorable American performance cars of the decade. When the Chevrolet Monte Carlo SS finally reached dealerships in 1983, it immediately attracted attention, not because it was the fastest car on the market, but because it looked unlike anything else in Chevrolet's lineup. It had presence. Long before you started the engine, the car gave off an unmistakable confidence. The aerodynamic front fascia, bold SS graphics, rear spoiler, unique alloy wheels, and lower stance made it clear that this wasn't an ordinary Monte Carlo. It looked like it belonged on a NASCAR speedway just as much as it belonged cruising down an American highway. Personally, I think Chevrolet absolutely nailed the styling. Even today, more than 40 years later, the Monte Carlo SS still turns heads because its design feels honest. It doesn't rely on oversized wings or exaggerated body kits. Instead, it has clean proportions that perfectly capture the spirit of the 1980s. Under the hood sat Chevrolet's high-output 305 cubic inch small-block V8, producing up to 180 horsepower depending on the model year. By modern standards, that number sounds modest, and even back then there were enthusiasts who wished Chevrolet had offered something more powerful. But it's important to remember the era. America was still recovering from years of emissions restrictions, shrinking engine outputs, and rising fuel prices. Simply offering a rear-wheel drive V8 coupe with respectable performance was already becoming something special. What really defined the Monte Carlo SS wasn't its peak horsepower, it was the way it delivered its power. The engine produced plenty of low-end torque, making the car feel relaxed around town while still providing enough punch to make highway passing effortless. It wasn't a high-revving sports car. It was a grand touring coupe built for long roads, open highways, and the unmistakable sound of a Chevrolet V8 echoing through the exhaust. Chevrolet paired the engine with a 4-speed automatic transmission, a choice that disappointed some enthusiasts hoping for a manual gearbox. Yet in reality, it suited the car's personality perfectly. The Monte Carlo SS wasn't trying to be a stripped-down race car. It was designed for drivers who wanted comfort during the daily commute but still wanted to enjoy themselves every time they pressed the accelerator. The suspension received revised springs, upgraded shocks, and thicker sway bars, giving the coupe noticeably better handling than the standard Monte Carlo. It still leaned in corners more than a European sports coupe, but compared to most American personal luxury cars of the early 1980s, the difference was obvious. The steering felt more responsive, body roll was reduced, and the entire car inspired much more confidence on winding roads. Inside, Chevrolet continued the same philosophy. The cabin wasn't filled with expensive technology or complicated electronics. Instead, it focused on what buyers actually cared about. Comfortable bucket seats, a driver-oriented dashboard, clear gauges, air conditioning, power windows, cruise control, and enough space to comfortably travel hundreds of miles without fatigue. Looking at the interior today, it's almost refreshing how simple everything feels. There are physical buttons, easy-to-read instruments, and excellent visibility. In my opinion, that's one of the biggest reasons these cars remain enjoyable classics. Nothing feels unnecessarily complicated. Everything serves a purpose. But as good as the Monte Carlo SS was, Chevrolet knew it wasn't alone. The mid-1980s became one of the most competitive periods for American performance coupes. Ford answered with the Fox body Mustang GT, a lighter and more aggressive car that appealed to younger enthusiasts. Thanks to its lighter weight and available 5-speed manual transmission, the Mustang often outperformed the Monte Carlo in straight-line acceleration. If your only goal was speed, the Ford usually had the advantage. Then there was Buick, quietly developing one of the most shocking performance cars of the decade. The Buick Regal T-Type and later the legendary Grand National abandoned the traditional V8 formula in favor of a turbocharged V6 that produced astonishing performance. The Grand National quickly became the benchmark for American acceleration during the 1980s, and in many ways, it stole the spotlight from the Monte Carlo SS. Pontiac also entered the fight with the Grand Prix, while Oldsmobile offered the revived 442. Each car had its own personality, its own loyal fanbase, and its own strengths. Yet Chevrolet never tried to beat all of them at their own game. Instead, the Monte Carlo SS carved out a completely different identity. It offered a balance of style, comfort, reliability, and everyday usability that many rivals struggled to match. Personally, I think that's exactly why the Monte Carlo SS has aged so gracefully. It wasn't obsessed with winning every comparison test or setting the quickest quarter-mile time. It focused on being a genuinely enjoyable car to live with every single day. And perhaps nothing reinforced that image more than NASCAR. Throughout the 1980s, the Monte Carlo became one of the most recognizable race cars in America. Fans watched it compete every weekend against Ford, Pontiac, Buick, and Oldsmobile on legendary tracks like Daytona, Talladega, Bristol, Charlotte, and Darlington. Some of the biggest names in stock car racing drove Monte Carlos, helping Chevrolet establish itself as one of NASCAR's dominant manufacturers. The connection between racing and the showroom floor was impossible to ignore. Buyers walked into dealerships after watching the Monte Carlo lead races on Sunday, and although the production car shared only its basic silhouette with the race car, it carried the same spirit. It represented speed, competition, and Chevrolet's commitment to American motorsport. For many owners, that emotional connection mattered just as much as horsepower figures. They weren't simply buying another coupe. They were buying a car that symbolized one of the greatest eras in NASCAR history. And while the Monte Carlo SS never became the fastest or most famous performance car of the decade, it quietly built something that would prove far more valuable with time, a loyal community of enthusiasts who appreciated it not for what it wasn't, but for exactly what it was. And as the years passed, that loyalty would only grow stronger, especially after Chevrolet made the difficult decision that would bring the Monte Carlo SS story to an unexpected end. The Chevrolet Monte Carlo SS was never the most powerful car of the 1980s. It never claimed to be the quickest, and it never tried to compete with exotic sports cars. Instead, it did something much more important. It reminded people that driving could still be fun, even during one of the toughest periods in American automotive history. Personally, I think that's what makes the Monte Carlo SS so special today. It wasn't built to chase records, it was built to keep the spirit of the American V8 alive when many believed that spirit was already gone. Thanks to its timeless styling, NASCAR heritage, unmistakable small-block soundtrack, and honest personality, the Monte Carlo SS has earned its place as one of the most underrated Chevrolets ever built. It may have lived in the shadow of the Buick Grand National or the Fox body Mustang, but sometimes the cars that receive the least attention end up becoming the ones enthusiasts appreciate the most years later. And that's exactly what happened here. The Monte Carlo SS wasn't just another coupe from the 1980s, it became one of the last true representatives of an era that refused to fade away. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more automotive history documentaries. And now I'd love to hear your opinion. Do you think the Chevrolet Monte Carlo SS deserves more recognition today, or would you choose one of its legendary rivals instead? Let me know down in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.